So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ruth Kruger and I work in knowledge translation and mobilization for the TDRA. And now for the show of the hour, Dr. Esme Fuller-Thomson. So Dr. Fuller-Thomson is a professor and director of the Institute for Life Course and Aging at the University of Toronto. She's cross-appointed to the faculties of social work, medicine, and nursing at the University of Toronto. Her research has been widely cited in the media, including the New York Times, Forbes, Times Magazine, Toronto Star, and the CBC. Her research examines social determinants of physical and mental health and later life cognition, trends in later life health, the long-term impact of early adversities, and depression among older adults during the pandemic. Esme joined the TDRA's Scientific Advisory Committee in the spring of 2023, and we're very pleased to have her here today to present on creating headlines from scientific discoveries.
So now to the topic, which is about press releases. So really your main partner in this is your, at least if you're at the university, it's your university's media relations office. If you're at a hospital, most hospitals have media relations offices. These are really, really helpful, but the issue is they're incredibly busy. Just think about how many profs at U of T and how many publications come out. So it takes them a long time to write a press release because they don't know the area. So my experience is if I draft the press release and then send it to them, when it only takes them half an hour instead of a week to put it out, it's in our mutual best interests. So the idea is to make it as easy as possible. So the question is, why bother with a press release? You showed up today, so I imagine you think it's worthwhile. But I morally think at a public university with funding that for my research, which is publicly funded, that this is just a part of my job description. I need to move my data, my findings out of the ivory tower, out of articles in journals that may be behind paywalls and are hard to get at, and into the general discussion. Also, we do our research because we care greatly about making a difference in the world. And it's hard to make a difference in the world if nobody reads what you write. And there are 1.8 million published articles annually. So you've got a lot of competition out there. And how do you make it manageable so that people are interested in reading yours? So this is a little mini experiment I did. We know that the number of academic citations or peer-reviewed citations that you get are strongly correlated with the number of media mentions. But of course, that could be not causal. In other words, what it's related to is that if you publish something important, the media cares about it and other people cite it. But so I did a little experiment and it wasn't really intentional. I just was way too busy last autumn. So I have 2 open access articles coming out last fall. Now, open access means that theoretically anybody in the world who wants to see it can see it, right? It's not behind a paywall. So we did this paper with my graduate student, Andy McNeil, on trajectories in depression during the pandemic. And I didn't get around to sending out the press release for 9 days after it's published. Usually you get it picked up the day. I mean, if you send out a press release, you get it the day it goes out, and then nobody's really interested in it 9 days later. So after 9 days, there were 0 media articles. We sent out a press release and we got 62. Well, that means that nobody was reading this article. I mean, nobody in the press was reading this article. It was just, I had to make it palatable and send it out. And similarly, this one was even longer. I mean, it really was a busy semester last year. So I didn't actually get around to sending the press release out for 2 months. I do not recommend that because better places like US News and World Report phoned me. And when they found out how old it was, they're like, we can't report anything that old. But other people picked it up. So it went from 0 media articles for 2 months. It was just dead as a doornail to 51 articles the day after we put the press release. So my experience is that it certainly seems to be worthwhile. And we're lucky in gerontology because almost everything we do is relevant and interesting to the general public. Like you could be working with fruit flies, and that's a little harder to make people interested or how to translate it. But particularly those working with humans and those working in older adults, People are naturally interested. So, but when I start thinking about knowledge dissemination, I start thinking about it way back, like literally at the time I'm doing the analysis. Because if I said to you that refugees have 2 points lower on a social support scale, that doesn't mean anything to you. And a matter of fact, I use this social support scale and it doesn't really mean anything to me either. 2 points doesn't mean anything. But buried in that social support scale, there's a question is, do you have at least one person to confide in? So if I tell you that refugees were 25% more likely to be without even one confidant, that means something to people. So I actually even think about how I'm going to disseminate the information and get the message across right back at the analysis stage. Similarly, if you talk about $1 increments, like $1 more in earning, it'll be statistically significant. I use sample sizes of 1 million, so everything's statistically significant, but it doesn't mean anything. But if I divide that and say, okay, how much is more is $10,000 in associated with a lower level of depression, that makes something that makes sense. Similarly, using a continuous measure of depression or PTSD is not that helpful. 2 points higher on a depression scale, 3 points higher on a PTSD scale. You don't have a sense of what it is, but if they provide you with cut points, these outcomes is either depressed or PTSD, having PTSD, yes, no, much easier to understand. Okay, so there's I'm going to provide you with absolutely nitty-gritty level of detail. You don't have to take any notes. If you're planning to do a press release soon, don't worry about it. I have a Word document that itemizes all of this. So you can just reach out to Ruth afterwards when she sends out the assessment form, and you can just pick it up. But so the background about me doing press releases was I was probably at least 5 years or more into my professor role here. And somebody from Media Services came by and asked us to pitch ideas to her. So I pitched an idea of a paper that was just coming out, and we went back and forth for a week with, this quote, did it mean this? We went back and forth, and we finally got a nice little article, a nice little press release, and it was posted, and I got media attention for it. I was like, wow, this is great. Well, within a year, I'd also published 2 other articles in 2 different journals. And sometimes the journals like the topic that you're working on. And so they have press release officers too, or media officers. And so the editors happen to have asked the press release officers in their journals to help me with them. So again, back and forth, takes a week. We went back and forth. We finally got them that we were happy. Press release went out, lots of coverage, all exciting. And then I sat down, this is like a year and a half later, I sat down with all 3 of them in front of me, and I realized they're just a formula. So I'm going to tell you what the formula is. It's super easy, but I just wish they told us in grad school. But those of you who are in grad school, I'm telling you in grad school, you'll already know it. Okay, so here's some things. Elsevier in particular is really fast in getting the papers up. So the minute it's accepted, it typically goes up. You don't really want that to happen because it's in the accepted form. It hasn't been proofed. You want only the polished form to go up. So literally when the article's accepted in most places, but in Elsevier, when I get the revise and resubmit cover letter, I put in this quote about that I'm working with media services at the university or your institution. I'm creating a Eureka alert, and we'll talk about Eureka alerts in a moment, and press release, but please don't publish the paper online until we finalize the corrected proofs. And then we'd like 3 days, a minimum of 3 days notice of, so that we can generate some interest. So here's the standard formula. And then it takes about 2 to 3 hours, I think, to write it. I mean, maybe some people are faster than I am, but this is the place I want you to think about going to. So I can't see people. I don't know. How many of you have heard of Eureka Alert before? Can you put your thumbs up if you've heard? Okay, got 1 thumb, 2 thumbs, and everybody else is okay. All right. Well, this is an amazing resource. It's from the American Academy of the Advancement of Science. And it's an online science news service, and it features health, etc. And only a few people, like only the best journal or the best institutions have permission to upload it there. So there are 12,000 registered science journalists who have access to the embargo data. So if I have a paper that's coming out, Friday at 5 a.m., I can have the media, the only person at U of T who can do it, there's like one person in media relations that can do it. So anyway, I work with my media relations officer. She approves it. She sends it off to Christian, who's the person at the center, and they post it, but they can embargo it. So they can say, okay, the article is going to come out on Friday at 5 a.m. And that way the people can say, oh, it's a really interesting research on improvements in dementia. I'm going to go out and interview caregivers of people with dementia and have a front page article about it, and I'll have it all ready to go at the embargo date. So it's a fantastic place to have your stuff posted. So what I'm telling you to do, or what I'm going through the instructions about how to do it, is actually to give you the formula for Eureka Alert. And that works well for any press release, but it means it's also going to work for Eureka Alert. Okay. So let me move this up here. Okay. So I love this quote from Oxford. That you really have to have a hook for your article. Like you can't just go on for details and details. And their quote was, if you cannot identify the hook, then it's unlikely that we can. So it's really up to you to say, what's the most important thing to talk about? So press releases are designed to be read by non-experts, so you got to keep it simple. Their idea is to entice reporters to cover your research. So you have to be clear, why are your findings important and who might be interested? Typically, they're used as filler for newspapers. They're not time sensitive. I mean, if you have a New England Journal of Medicine article, sure, it's time sensitive, and there'll be lots of people interested in talking to you about that. But I mean, our average publications, they're really more filler, and so they like to pick it up, and the way you present it, they can cut it off at being 500, 250 words, 500 words, 750 words, and they'll just use it as filler. So I put out a press release and it appears in Times of India, that with the quotes, et cetera, that we set up. So at least 99% of coverage, nobody actually even phones me. I've set the press release up and that's what they pick up because they trust Eureka Alert. The only legitimate sources go up in Eureka Alert. So the newspapers around the world, and I've had it translated into Thai and Chinese, et cetera, they trust Eureka Alert for their news. So when do you do it? I do it when I'm doing my proofs because everything's fresh in my mind, and I might pull out sentences that I just use as quotes to kind of get things out. And also, even though you might have asked that it's got an embargo date of, September 27th, you might find out sometimes they put it up earlier. So if it's all ready to go, so after I've drafted it, I send it immediately to our media relations officer, Dale, and she approves it or modifies it. And we've got it comfortably done sort of 2 days after I've got the proofs, so that whenever the proofs come through and they actually publish it, we're ready to go. So when I said we talk about specifics, it turns out you want a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, and you would, if you choose to have a embargo date of 5 a.m., you get more pickup. I was just talking to PLOS One, and they only do 2 p.m. Embargo dates. That's not great because it's too late in the news cycle. So if you do something with PLOS One, you will probably have it posted for 5 a.m. the next day, so that it's more interesting. Fridays and Mondays, I've tried, just because things have come through, you do get lower pickup on Fridays and Mondays or before a long weekend. But then there's sometimes things you think would be loser times, like over the Christmas holidays. And if there's no news, you get a lot of pickup. So you never quite know. So then it's easier to generate media attention if the publication coincides with a date of interest. So of particular interest to this group, September 21st is World Alzheimer's Day. So if you had a paper coming out theoretically in August, you can often just contact the production editor and ask, can you just hold it off to September 21st? And then that helps with the hook that people might be interested in it. There's a whole list of incredible number of awareness days, weeks, and months at this blog. So literally, I'm going to go through what every line has. So at the top, you have the embargo time and date, and you put it in bold. The title has to be a maximum of 90 characters, including spaces. And you'll see sometimes people did not count, and you kind of have a fail that the title falls off. And literally, you use 25-point bold and bold. And then you have a subheadline. So the subheadlines can be much longer, 255 characters, including spaces. It's a smaller font. You italicize it. And I'll go over what, and then for ours, we're U of T, but obviously if you're at Baycrest, you'd put Baycrest as the line and work with their media relationships, even if you're, or do both, one or the other. So typically you have your university or your institution and your location. My experience is that positive news, nobody's really interested in. So if, for example, if you say something like, I don't know, if you say something like X% are depressed, you'll get a lot of coverage. But if you do 100 minus X% have recovered, people aren't as interested, sadly. So there's different types of headlines and subtitles. You can summarize all your key findings. So here are some examples. So older adults with asthma are at high risk of COVID-19. And then the subheading is like, half of individuals with asthma and a pre-pandemic history of depression experienced depression for the first time during COVID-19 pandemic. And then 1 in 7, experienced depression again during the pandemic, and 1 in 7 older adults with asthma and no history of depression. So these are older adults who'd never been depressed prior to the pandemic, developed depression for the first time. So that's kind of like the whole take home for the paper. Obviously, you've got more in here, but you can have all those details. This was about refugees. So we found that 1 in 4 older refugees are in psychological distress, even though it was decades after resettlement. I think the average time since these older adults had arrived was 40 years in Canada. So you can go with catchier headlines, but you tend to have less information. So this one, some surprisingly good news about anxiety, actually got a fair bit of pickup. So what we did is we looked at people with a history of anxiety disorders, and we showed that 70% of them were free of anxiety disorders, and 40% were in excellent mental health, which is this really high level of well-being. So not only are they free of anxiety disorders, they're free of all mental disorders, and they were happy daily or almost daily, and they had good social support and good psychological well-being. So in fact, 40% of people with a history of anxiety disorder got to that place. This is, this one, we were looking at cognitive health of older adults, and we looked at a whole bunch of predictors using the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging. And the title was Nutrition is a Key Ingredient for Cognitive Health of Midlife and Older Canadians. Now I have to tell you, my co-author, Karen Davison, is a nutritionist, and she came up with the cute title, but it actually got a lot of pickup. And so we found all, we found all kinds of things, but that's the one we emphasized. So sometimes it's also translating findings into something more tangible. So we had a prospective study for 18 years looking at baseline mental health and seeing age, like if there was premature mortality. So it turns out if you did not have flourishing health at the baseline, which was a combination of happiness and well-being and things, if you did not, even when I took into account or sometimes people aren't happy because they're ill, I took that all into account, that they died on average 5 months earlier. In fact, in the survival analysis, it was a risk ratio of 19% that people died, but that earlier. But of premature mortality, but that's not really, 19% doesn't mean anything, but somebody's like, oh, 5 months in 18 years, that makes sense, right? Okay, then this is a study. We were looking at the rate of decline in cognitive impairment between 2008 and 2017, which is only 10 years. It's the US. We had a really big sample. We had 5.3 million people, about 500,000 people a year. It was using the American Community Survey. And we showed there was a huge decline, particularly among women, in 23%. So from an epidemiological perspective, a decline of 23%, or like an improvement in the prevalence of cognitive impairments of 23% is incredible. But 23% doesn't make much to most people. So what we did is we said, if the prevalence of cognitive impairment had remained at the 2008 levels, in other words, they hadn't improved to 2017, there would have been an additional 1.1 million older Americans who had serious cognitive problems in 2017. So by switching it to numbers, people can kind of resonate with that. I was like, oh, an extra million people, I got it. It's really improved. Okay, so then the other point is we can also focus on the most novel finding. So we found that low fruit and vegetable intake and higher body fat was linked to anxiety disorders. Well, we also had found that chronic pain and serious physical health problems were associated, but that's so old news, nobody would have been paying much attention to it. So we put the nutrition up front, and then we put that information lower down. Then this paper was on linking the paper. I do a lot of work on early adversities and later life health outcomes. This was on looking at adults who as children had witnessed parental domestic violence, and it increased the risk of suicide. Now, that was very novel because people hadn't looked at it before. We also found that childhood sexual abuse and childhood physical abuse were risk factors for attempted suicide, but that had been so well studied. We did discuss it lower down, but certainly that didn't make the title. So if you write hypothesis papers, you can always ask questions, which is a nice way of going about it. So here's this one. This paper, I'm wondering if this huge improvement in cognitive problems in older adults, and by the way, it's also the level of hip fractures are improving, and these improvements have been going on for several decades. I'm just wondering if it's because we phased out leaded gasoline. So leaded gasoline levels were really, really high in the 1970s when I was a kid. So if you can think of the Flint, Michigan water crisis, which in 2014, was all over the news, that they had lead was sort of leaching into the water because of their pipes. And 5% of the kids had blood lead levels above 5 micrograms per deciliter. And the mean now in the general population is under 1 microgram per deciliter. So this was really serious. It was like an order of magnitude higher. But in my generation, 98.2% of us had above 5. And so like in 1976, 98.2% of us had above 5. 88% of us had above 10. The mean level for African-American kids who were disproportionately in inner city, so they were exposed to the air pollution from the burning traffic, from the burning cars or combustion burning, and their mean was 22. Now at 40, you take out every ounce of blood in a person and give them new blood, and yet we had it just everywhere in the system. So anyway, that was the hypothesis paper, and it was really great. I got to talk to some people and generate a discussion, and also make some connections about people who might want to be able to study this with me. This is another hypothesis paper about whether people in developing countries who present with psychosis don't really have schizophrenia, but they have a gene-environment interaction with niacin deficiency, because there is a disorder called pellagra where people present as though they are psychotic. About 5 to 8% of people with pellagra appear as though they have active psychosis, but you give them a high dose niacin and they can walk away in 2 months, but within a few weeks actually. But the idea is there's a reason to believe, just because of some new genome-wide association studies in India, that surprisingly strong indicator of schizophrenia in India is associated with a niacin deficiency, a niacin metabolizing allele. So this is why I'm thinking that maybe some of the people are not schizophrenic, they have pellagra. Sometimes pellagra, normally it has terrible skin disorders, but there's something called pellagra, thin pellagra, where you don't have the normal telltale skin problems. So here we go. We've got a maximum of 500 to 700 words. Fewer is fine. You order information from the most important to the least, because somebody will, if it's filler, they'll take out the last paragraph or two and just dump it in. Oops, sorry. Don't say too much, or avoid hyperbole. Avoid jargon. In my field, we talk about SES for socioeconomic status and people's eyes roll. Avoid too many technical details. So I typically tried my ideas out on my kids. Perfect when they're about 10. They're older than that now, but they just to see if they can pay attention to the 3-minute sort of cocktail party overview. If not, then I probably haven't presented it clearly enough. And there's a million things in all your papers, but you only want to talk about at most the 2 to 3 most interesting. And the first paragraph in particular needs to catch people's interest and be engaging, sort of the 1-minute elevator speech. You're supposed to use a lot of short paragraphs with spaces between them. If it isn't self-evident why the findings are important, unexpected or exciting, make sure that you make that clear. And then you need quotes, because basically when it's a filler article, they want to pretend that they've done it themselves. So the media regulation's not always crazy about this, because I have a lot of quotes in there, because I try to make sure every co-author gets a quote, because it's nice for students. But so it's a little bit longer than usual. So I literally try, but never more than 1 quote per paragraph. And I draft all the quotes. So basically when I'm writing it, I put words in everybody's mouth, but I do send it out to them to get approved. Basically, I'm just pulling pieces and making it a little catchier. We were surprised to find, and then put whatever we found in the paper, sort of thing. And then you put the quote, and then co-author, you put the name and their title and position at the end. So here's a quote from something that came out last fall from Mabel Ho. Here it says doctoral candidate. She defended this week, so she's Dr. Ho now. So this was about successful aging. So these are people who had started off without cognitive or serious disabilities or depression, and they were followed for 3 to 4 years. And we found that 70% of them were still thriving, these older adults. So her quote was, "We were surprised and delighted to learn that more than 70% of our sample maintained their excellent state of health across the study period." All the details about her. "Our findings underline the importance of a strength-based rather than a deficit-based focus on aging and older adults. The media and research tend to ignore the positive and just focus on the problems." So somewhere in the press release near the bottom, you tell them where it was published. The study was published online this week in the journal or whatever. At a minimum, try to send out the press release in the same month it's published in. Ideally, you want it a day or a day after, because as I said, better media sources like US News and World Report, they won't publish anything that's more than a few weeks late. But lots of other places will. So if you just published something a month ago or 2 months ago and you're like, I should do a press release on it, go ahead and do it. You'll probably get some pickup. So near the bottom, usually it's the second last paragraph, I put the details about the study, but only about this level of detail. So the study was based on 10 consecutive waves of the American Community Survey, and we were approximately 500,000 in each, a total of 5.4 million. The last paragraph, you put a quote that sums it up. So our finding from the study of over 5 million older Americans is definitely a very welcome good news story, indicating a steep decline in the prevalence of cognitive impairment among older Americans. And then we still need to investigate whether these positive trends will continue in the decades ahead and why men's rates of improvements are lagging behind those of women. Then you go with this ... Then you give the DOI number and the publication source, and you provide the contact details. And if there's a paywall for the article, if, in other words, you have not published it open access, you just put this little code in that a full copy of the paper is available to credentialed journalists upon request and to contact you. On the day of the press release, particularly if you put it out at 5 a.m., particularly in the morning, try to have some free time so you can answer and check your emails. Most reporters, they want an answer within an hour. So I teach on Tuesdays, so I usually put my press releases out on Wednesdays, so I have a little more time. And then I usually have a one-page point form list of the key points that I want to emphasize, and a quote or two that I would like to remember when they're asking me something, like to get the information out. So you can track media pickup with Google searches, but I don't know if you knew this. This is brand new. You know that we've got this new thing at UToronto about discover.research.utoronto. Well, they give you your altmetric score, which looks like this, which is, so this is an article that just came out. So this is about, I looked at the decline about both Black and white older adults. There was an improvement in disabilities across time, but the cognitive disabilities improved more in the Blacks than versus the whites. So the disparities in disability, the racial disparities decreased. That was kind of the take home. So it'll tell you where it is. So this is the top 5% of all research that was published. And it'll tell you who picked up the articles and where, that there was 19 news outlets and 1 blog. Yeah, and this just came out last week or the week before. So that's great that, you know, we can at least find it out. Okay, and then I've got this Word document that's available for you if you want the details.